There are moments in history when change does not come with the thunder of cannons, but with the quiet courage of nations that refuse to kneel. That change is unfolding today in Africa's Sahel. In Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, young leaders are standing against systems that drained their resources for 60 years. The remarkable part is not their defiance. It is that NATO, the most powerful alliance of our time, can do nothing but watch. Not long ago, French soldiers and their allies filled the Sahel. Bases were seen as permanent, flags flew above barracks, and speeches promised security and prosperity. In 2017, French President Emmanuel Macron stood in Ouagadougou, declaring partnership for a new century. Yet only a few years later, those same troops are packing up. Flags come down. Barracks stand empty. African governments reclaim what was once dictated from Paris. This is not simply a military retreat. It is the unraveling of an entire system. For decades, France and its allies extracted billions from the Sahel through unfair contracts, trade controls, and currency systems. Gold, uranium, and oil flowed to Europe. Yet the people providing those resources remained among the poorest on Earth. To a new generation, that contradiction became unbearable. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso spoke plainly. Sovereignty is not a slogan. It is the right to control resources, to say no to exploitation, and to decide a nation's future without foreign permission. He and his peers tore up old agreements, renegotiated contracts, and sought partners who offered respect instead of dominance. Here lies the truth that unsettles Western capitals. These leaders are not threatening Europe or America with armies. They are doing something far more dangerous to the old order. They are keeping their wealth for their own people. And NATO, with all its weapons, cannot bomb away a people's determination to stand. Its media cannot persuade Africa's youth, who have seen Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, that foreign occupation equals stability. A new generation has decided that dignity is worth sacrifice. For many Americans watching from afar, this moment may feel distant. But think of it this way. Every parent knows what it means to sacrifice for a child's future. Every veteran knows what it means to endure hardship for the sake of freedom. The young people of the Sahel are making that same choice. They are willing to suffer short-term struggles if it means their children will inherit dignity instead of dependency. So the question now is not whether these nations will resist. They already are. The real question is whether the Imperial Chessboard can survive if the pawns refuse to play. To understand why NATO finds itself paralyzed in the Sahel, we must begin with economics. Power in the 21st century is not measured only by missiles or armies. It is measured by who controls the resources that fuel those armies, and by who profits from the mines, the oil wells, and the trade routes. For decades, Western powers held Africa in a tight economic grip. The numbers tell the story. France alone extracted the equivalent of nearly $500 billion from its former colonies through currency controls, unfair contracts, and hidden taxes. Gold left Burkina Faso on ships bound for Europe. Uranium from Niger fueled French nuclear reactors. Oil flowed from the Sahel into Western industries. Yet the very nations providing this wealth remained poor, indebted, and dependent. For generations, families in these countries lived with a bitter contradiction. Beneath their feet lay treasures the world desperately needed. Yet above ground, they struggled to feed their children or send them to school. The soil was rich, but the people were poor. When Ibrahim Traoré came to power in Burkina Faso, He looked at this equation and asked a simple question that many Africans had whispered for years. If we are so rich in resources, why are we still so poor? His answer was not words, but action. Within months, contracts with foreign mining companies were renegotiated. Revenues that once disappeared into European banks were redirected toward national projects. Gold that had built palaces abroad was now building roads and schools at home. In Niger, the injustice was even more striking. For decades, French energy security rested on cheap uranium dug from Nigerian soil. The price paid to Niger was often less than €1 per kilogram, while the same uranium sold abroad for more than 200. A country rich in uranium was ranked among the poorest nations on Earth. The new leadership said enough. Contracts were placed under review. Deals were opened to partners willing to provide fair prices and technology transfer. Mali, too, began to change direction. Instead of relying on loans tied to World Bank or IMF conditions, it sought infrastructure deals with China and security cooperation with Russia. The goal was not to replace one master with another, but to diversify partnerships so that no single outside power could dictate terms. For NATO, this shift was alarming. Unlike armed uprisings, which could be crushed with force, economic independence was harder to reverse. Once a nation built roads with its own gold revenues or financed hospitals without foreign aid, it created a precedent. And that precedent spread faster than any revolutionary pamphlet. Across Africa, young people watched closely. They saw that Burkina Faso was funding infrastructure from its own soil. They saw Niger stand up to unfair uranium deals. They saw Mali chart a new path. And they began to ask, why not us? Why not our country? This is where economics meets family life. A father in Niamey asked why uranium lights the streets of Paris while his children study by candlelight. A mother in Ouagadougou asked why gold builds wealth in Europe, while her village clinic lacks medicine. These are not abstract questions. They are questions of justice, of dignity, of the simple right to see the fruit of one's labor feed one's own household. NATO cannot answer such questions with slogans about stability or democracy. No speech can erase the fact that for decades, African wealth enriched others while African families went hungry. And so the economic foundation of the Sahel Revolution became NATO's greatest weakness. These leaders are not declaring war on the West. They are doing something far more threatening to the old order. They are keeping their wealth at home. They are redirecting the streams of gold, uranium, and oil to flow toward their own schools, their own hospitals, and their own children. And once a people taste the power of using their own resources for their own future, it is nearly impossible to convince them to return to dependency. If economics explains the foundation of Africa's new sovereignty, demographics explain why it has become unstoppable. The Sahel is home to the youngest population on Earth. More than 70% of its people are under 30 years old. That youthful force is reshaping politics in ways that NATO strategists never imagined. For decades, Western powers relied on a familiar pattern. Older elites, often educated in Paris, London, or Washington, returned to govern in the image of their mentors. They signed contracts that favored foreign corporations. They permitted military bases on their soil. They reassured the West that nothing essential would change. In return, they received loans, aid packages, and applause from international conferences. But the generation now rising in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey has no patience for such arrangements. They did not grow up reading colonial textbooks. They grew up with smartphones in their hands. They have seen videos of Western interventions in Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. They were told those wars would bring democracy, yet what they saw was destruction. They watched migrants flee across deserts and seas, not because of African rebellions, but because of foreign wars. They drew their own conclusions. This youth is not easily deceived by old propaganda. When French media labels Sahelian leaders as juntas or strongmen, young Africans compare those words with the reality they live. They see schools being built with local revenues. They see gold and uranium kept in the country, rather than shipped abroad. They see leaders who walk among them, speak their languages, and wear traditional clothing instead of imported suits. And they ask themselves, who really has legitimacy? Is it the Western-backed presidents of the past, who enriched themselves while their people suffered? Or is it the young leaders who risk everything to defend sovereignty? The answer is clear in the streets. In Ouagadougou, when rumors of French interference spread, tens of thousands of young people flood Independence Square. They carry banners reading, "Our resources, our dignity." They chant for sovereignty until their voices shake the city. In Mali, students organize forums to debate how to end dependence on the CFA franc. In Niger, young farmers demand that uranium revenues be used to electrify villages rather than enrich banks in Europe. This energy is not confined to the Sahel. In Lagos, students share videos of Traore speaking about dignity. In Nairobi, young professionals debate new models of development. In Johannesburg, activists echo the call for sovereignty. Social media carries these messages far and wide. The words of Sahel leaders reach millions within hours, creating a sense of unity across borders. For NATO, this represents a nightmare without a military solution. You can destroy a bunker with bombs, but you cannot destroy an idea rooted in millions of young minds. You can topple a government, but you cannot topple an entire generation. What makes this generation even more formidable is that they do not settle for slogans. They demand results. When Traoré delivers new roads, when Niger's leaders renegotiate uranium prices, when Mali invests in infrastructure, these young citizens see progress with their own eyes. Performance creates legitimacy, and legitimacy strengthens resistance. The West fears this shift because it changes the rules of power. For decades, legitimacy in Africa often came from Western approval. A leader was considered credible if he shook hands in Paris or Washington. Now, legitimacy comes from whether young people see schools, jobs, and roads. Approval is measured not by foreign headlines, but by local families. And here lies the turning point. Young Africans are willing to endure short-term hardship if it brings long-term freedom. As one student in Burkina Faso said, "It is better to suffer for a few years with dignity than to live forever on our knees." This new generation is fearless, connected, and determined. They know the cost of sovereignty, and they are prepared to pay it. For NATO, for France, for the West, this is the greatest challenge. Not an army to be defeated, but a generation that has already decided it will write its own future. When people hear the word NATO, they imagine fighter jets streaking across the sky, aircraft carriers patrolling oceans, and satellites tracking movements from space. On paper, it is the most powerful military alliance in human history. Yet in the Sahel, with all its firepower, NATO has been reduced to watching from the sidelines. Why? Because the military dynamics of the region have shifted in ways that make traditional intervention costly and futile. The first reason is justification. Sahel governments are not waging wars abroad. They are not threatening European capitals or launching missiles into Western cities. They are asserting control over their own resources, renegotiating contracts, and choosing new partners. What justification could NATO present to its citizens? To defend French mining contracts? To punish Africans for preferring fairer trade? Without a clear external threat, it is nearly impossible to convince people in Paris, London, or Washington that sending troops is necessary. The second reason lies in strategy. Sahel leaders have studied past interventions and learned from them. They know that resisting foreign militaries does not always mean open battle. It often means making occupation unsustainable. French bases lose effectiveness when local communities withdraw cooperation. Intelligence networks collapse when locals refuse to share information. Logistics fail when governments deny overflight rights or port access. Intervention becomes a nightmare before the first shot is fired. The third reason is unity. Unlike Libya under Gaddafi, which was left isolated, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have presented a united front. They formed the Alliance of Sahel states, coordinating policies and supporting one another politically. An attack on one is now seen as an attack on all. For NATO, this multiplies the cost of any military campaign. It would not be confronting a single country, but an entire bloc. At the same time, the Sahel Alliance has secured alternative support. Russia has provided training and equipment, particularly in air defense and drones. China has invested in infrastructure that doubles as logistical depth. Turkey has exported armored vehicles and unmanned aircraft. These partnerships may not match NATO in scale, but they make intervention more expensive and less certain. But the most powerful obstacle is not military at all. It is legitimacy. Conventional superiority means little if the people themselves stand with their leaders. In Ouagadougou, in Bamako, in Niamey, the streets fill with young men and women whenever rumors of foreign interference spread. They wave flags, chant for sovereignty, and declare that any attack on their government is an attack on their own dignity. For NATO, this changes everything. Fighting an army is one thing. Fighting an entire population is another. Consider the asymmetric dimension. NATO excels in conventional war, but insurgent resistance drains even the strongest armies. Local fighters blend into the population, strike supply lines, and wear down morale. The Sahel governments would not need to win in the traditional sense. They would only need to survive long enough for Western publics to lose patience. After Iraq and Afghanistan, patience for long wars is thin in Europe and America. Another factor is technology. Every civilian casualty, every burned village, every drone strike gone wrong would be broadcast instantly on social media. Unlike interventions of the past, Western powers cannot control the narrative. Images would spread across Africa and the world within minutes, fueling outrage and solidarity. Political leaders in Europe and America know the risks. They know their citizens would question why tax money is being spent to defend mining companies, while hospitals at home lack funds. Finally, there is the moral dimension. NATO governments claim to defend democracy and human rights. Yet how could they justify removing leaders who are building schools, improving security, and reclaiming sovereignty? To intervene would expose the mission as pure imperialism. Even within Western societies, opposition would rise quickly. Soldiers would ask why they must risk their lives in wars that have no moral ground. Families would wonder why their sons and daughters were sent to fight people defending their own land. In short, NATO's advantage collapses under the weight of politics, legitimacy, and morality. Fighter jets and tanks cannot erase the fact that Sahel leaders enjoy genuine support from their citizens, and every attempt to challenge them by force would likely ignite greater resistance. This is why NATO hesitates. The alliance has the weapons, but not the justification. It has the power, but not the legitimacy. And in a battle between bombs and dignity, it is dignity that proves harder to defeat. The revolution in the Sahel is no longer a regional story. It has become a signal across the African continent, and a tremor shaking assumptions around the world. Decisions taken in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey now influence debates in cities thousands of miles away. Within Africa, the message spread quickly. Young people from Senegal to South Africa saw that leaders in the Sahel were standing without foreign permission. They saw that sovereignty was not an abstract idea, but a living reality. Schools funded by national wealth, roads built without loans, hospitals operating without aid packages. The African Union, long criticized as slow and hesitant, felt the pressure. Leaders realized that to openly oppose the Sahel would risk alienating their own citizens. The youth of Africa admire Ibrahim Traoré and his peers because they represent something their parents only dreamed of: independence in practice, not just in speeches. Civil society responded as well. Students organized debates about resource control. Labor unions demanded fairer trade agreements. Farmers in Ghana and Nigeria asked why their cocoa and oil should enrich foreign companies while their families struggled. Across the continent, the same question echoed: if Burkina Faso can do it, why not us? Beyond Africa, the ripple reached every corner of the globe. Russia offered security support where the West had failed. China expanded infrastructure projects that strengthened trade routes and transport. India sought deeper cooperation in energy and agriculture. Turkey, with its growing defense industry, supplied drones and vehicles. For the Sahel, this multipolar world provided choices that never existed before. Instead of dependence on a single power, nations could now negotiate from strength. For NATO and its allies, the implications were unsettling. An intervention would not be a small regional operation. It would provoke continental backlash and might even bring confrontation with global powers eager to support Africa's awakening. Western media continued to frame the Sahel as unstable, but audiences across the global South recognized the movement for what it was: a refusal to remain dependent. Even inside Western societies, questions began to rise. Citizens asked why their taxes should support foreign corporations while their own communities lacked jobs and health care. Veterans who had fought in Iraq and Afghanistan wondered aloud why young men and women should again risk their lives in wars that had no moral justification. Churches and community leaders in America compared the Sahelian struggle to the fight for civil rights, a demand for dignity, plain and simple. The most important change, however, is within Africa itself. The Sahel movement proved that unity is possible. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger showed that cooperation makes them stronger than isolation. That example is now pushing other African states to rethink old alliances, to reconsider unfair contracts, and to look inward for strength. What began as a regional stand has grown into a continental awakening, and with every passing day, the call for dignity grows louder. It is no longer just the voices of 3 countries. It is the heartbeat of a continent demanding to be treated as equal, not as a source of endless extraction. As we step back and look at the Sahel, one truth becomes clear: NATO, with all its power, is silent because the rules have changed. Military superiority cannot defeat movements rooted in popular support. Financial leverage loses its grip when nations diversify partnerships. Old propaganda collapses when young people see results in their own lives. What is unfolding in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger is not a passing rebellion. It is the birth of a new political reality. For decades, Western leaders assumed Africa would remain dependent, controlled through debt, aid, and intimidation. But with every renegotiated contract, with every kilometer of road built from local wealth, with every public stand for sovereignty, the continent is moving into a new era. This moment belongs not only to the Sahel, it belongs to Africa as a whole. From Algiers to Accra, from Lagos to Lusaka, people are realizing that their future does not require permission from abroad. Sovereignty is not an abstract word. It is schools funded by African resources. It is jobs created by African industries. It is dignity restored when decisions are made in African capitals instead of foreign boardrooms. For the West, this shift is deeply unsettling. It means the end of easy assumptions that Africa will provide resources without resistance. It means accepting that African leaders will now negotiate as equals. It means confronting the reality that no arsenal can intimidate populations who have already chosen dignity over dependence. For Africans, the challenge is just as serious. Independence demands unity, discipline, and accountability. It requires building economies that serve people rather than enrich elites. The Sahel has opened the door. The rest of the continent must walk through it with courage and wisdom. And for you, watching this story unfold, there is also a role to play. Share these stories so the truth is not buried beneath mainstream narratives. Speak about them with your family, your church, your community. Engage in conversations that break the myth of African helplessness. Every comment, every share, every voice adds to the growing call for justice. So I leave you with this question. What does dignity mean to you? Is it comfort without freedom, or sacrifice with self-respect? If this message touched your heart, write your answer below. Subscribe to this channel, share it with others, and be part of a conversation that cannot be silenced. Because in the end, freedom is not given. It is chosen, defended, and passed on to the next generation. And the people of the Sahel have already chosen.